Okay, next up we have Professor Joe Howe, and Joe is the Executive Director of the Chester Energy Institute at the University of Chester. Joe's got a background in geography and planning, environmental science and environmental engineering. At the moment, Joe is the academic lead for the Northwest IDC HyNet deployment project, and he's very much at the forefront of the UK's emerging net zero and energy transition agenda. He's got a passion for STEM skills, and he's really working very closely with the Department for Education on this agenda. He's also a board member and trustee of their Arm's Length Engineering Construction Industries Training Board, and he's also on the advisory group of the Department for Education Institute for Apprentices and Technical Education. I'm sure Joe will introduce you to many more skills within the next 30 minutes. Over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Many thanks for that kind introduction, Juliana. Richard, fabulous presentation. Today, colleagues, we're talking about net zero, net negative and connected places. What fabulous topics we've got. Some of you may well be asking, why on earth have we got this bloke on the call presenting to us who knows a little bit about industrial decarbonisation and industrial and hydrogen and carbon capture and storage? We're in the centre of this really rural area. Now, when Juliana threw out to me this challenge of presenting to you today, I was kind of thinking the same thing. Why on earth has Juliana asked me to do this when I focus on industrial decarbonisation and skills? So I've been giving this some thought, and I hope today I can present you with some of the reasons and some of the connectivities between my work and what may well be going on in rural areas, and hopefully try to challenge some of the rural areas as well. And indeed, I want to try and challenge the whole theme of today. We talk about net zero. We've talked about net zero for too long now, especially now that the COP summit is out of the way. Maybe, given the climate and ecological crisis that we're currently facing in the world, we might want to consider talking about issues of net negative. And that's a challenge that I want to throw at Shropshire. That's one of the challenges that I want to throw out to rural areas. And hopefully during today's presentation, you'll get to understand why I want to throw that challenge out. And hopefully we might well have a discussion about how we can all work together through connecting places, rural areas, urban areas, industrial areas, to realise that opportunity of a net negative future. Yeah, on this first slide, Juliana's provided you with a very kind introduction to me. I don't need to go into this, but it's a bit of background to me and the various groups and organisations that I'm involved in. What I want to do is, slide please. So these are some of the things that you may well have heard over the last couple of weeks or read about in the last couple of weeks from the start of COP towards the end of COP. The Queen wants us to get on and do something. She's absolutely right. We need to get on and do something because we are in this climate and ecological emergency. Greta, absolutely right. A lot of this is all about blah, blah, blah. Investment, investment, investment. The same winners and the same losers. And so again, we need to be demonstrating some leadership, not just about net zero, but potentially coming up with propositions around net negative. And one of the things that Richard, I think, alluded to during his presentation that came out during COP is the government's ambitions to decarbonise the whole of the UK power system by 2035. Now, let's just wait and think about that for a second. We've kind of taken coal-fired power stations, quite rightly so, offline. Now we're talking about by 2035 taking all gas-fired power stations offline as well. Now, this morning, colleagues, when I looked at GridWatch, I noticed that combined gas cycle plants on a cloudy, non-sunny, non-windy, relatively cool morning was providing 58% of power in the UK. That's a massive transition, a massive area that we've got to replace during the course of the next 13 years. Now, today I want to try and present you with some of the ideas around how we can overcome that and how potentially we can begin to address that. But blimey, we need to get a move on. Next slide, please. So this is where I work. I work at the heart of one of the largest industrial clusters in England, in the UK, just south of the Mersey Estuary, in Cheshire. Stanlow Oil Refinery, you may well know. Urenco, you may well know. And certainly Rock Savage International and the Ineos plant at Runcorn, you will know, because all of you have probably drunk some of their products today with the chlorine that they produce to ensure that our drinking water is safe to drink. Right hand side of this slide, a whole series of policies that I could very much go into around decarbonisation, hydrogen strategy and climate targets for 2050. Particularly the one I would highlight is the fifth carbon budget, 78% reduction of CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2035. 2035, I mentioned it before, 13 years away. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the key things I thought might be of interest today, and there may well be questions that come out from this, is some of the big trajectories around the net zero transition, or indeed the net negative transition, as I want to argue with you. I could read each one of these out to you, but I won't, because I want you to consider them. But I want to flag up one or two, but I want you to consider them in terms of questions. The first one on the left-hand side, I want to ask you about the relationship between rural and carbon capture and storage and industrial and power areas, the linkages between Shropshire and perhaps Cheshire, the connecting of places across the border between two adjacent counties. I think it's very possible, but I don't know whether or not it's being talked about or deliberated about at all, and I'd like to know whether or not it is from you guys. The second one I want to argue about here and perhaps get some views on is the issue of carbon prices. I'm watching carbon prices on a weekly basis going in one direction, and I want to know whether or not you have any questions or thoughts about that movement and what it might mean for a rural economy. What might it mean for an agricultural area with cows, for instance, with lots of methane emissions? What's the actual impact of that upon the locality, and how again can we work across different rural boundaries and connect with industrial areas to perhaps begin to realise, if there are opportunities in this, realise some of the opportunities afforded by this. But what I really want to focus on today is the issue of power and ways in which we can use rural areas through agricultural places to generate power through energy, particularly in relation to waste and the waste hierarchy. I won't go into any more on this slide. I'll go on to the next slide. So I'm sure that many of you in Shropshire are thinking about these big themes which are actually framing the sort of work that you're doing on this energy, this carbon transition, this journey to net negative. And it is the rural areas that can deliver on net negative. So lots of macro themes here that are pulled out for you to consider. I do have strictly confidential on there. It's not anymore because this is in the public domain. This is some of the work that I was doing for the hydrogen strategy. Read chapter 3 of the hydrogen strategy if you want to have a look at some of my work. On this particular slide, some of the key highlights that I want to throw out to you. You can have a look at the rest of them. We've not got much time. You know, we look at the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and they're talking about 1.5 degrees as being a key switching point. We've seen last week in the agreements, we're talking about 1.8 degrees by the end of this century. We've only got one energy transition. We've only got time for one energy transition. And a man of my age, I want to get a move on to make sure that I'm leaving a legacy to my children, which is somewhat better than it is right now, and somewhat better than the impact that potentially I've had on my children. So what are the key issues here? The things that are coming across from government right now. The polluter will pay. We're seeing an increase in that carbon pricing. We're seeing increasing taxes going towards carbon and methane emissions. There's a huge drive on the levelling up agenda, and when Juliana asked me to give this presentation, I rather hoped that the levelling up white paper would have come out, because I think there will be some interesting insights from the levelling up side white paper to consider for rural areas. We've got some big questions about who will pay for for this energy transition, and how will that impact upon rural and urban areas? Back to that connectivity issue, the previous speaker Richard and the Connected Places Catapult. I think there are some challenges there about who will play and how we will connect these geographical places and these geographical communities around the payments for this. And then finally, I think at the moment, one of the key areas that I'm seeing coming out from government, it seems as though there's lots of work going on at the moment on business models associated with carbon, business models associated with methane, business models associated with hydrogen around different technologies. Don't think Richard quite touched upon that, but that's going to be a significant framing area in terms of the future direction of travel and opportunity for SMEs and indeed large companies, colleagues. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do now is go through 4 different sectors and look at some of the key areas, some of the key policy dimensions, some of the key timelines around the energy transition, and ask again some constructive questions around what does this mean for rural areas? What does this mean in terms of decarbonising the rural? Because we have got to get a move on. Look at some of these targets in relation to environment and climate change just over the next 13 years. We know that air pollution is coming along very, very swiftly, and again, we're expecting announcements early next year on stricter air emissions that will be imposed by government. I think most of those will be in urban areas, to be honest with you, but how long will it be before some critically constructive questions are asked of rural areas as well? We know about the 5 gig of hydrogen production that's coming. We know that there are going to be 2 industrial clusters operational by 2035. One of them is just to the north of Shropshire, and I will ask about the interconnectivity around that. I could go on. Energy from waste I'll come back to in due course. 2030, that's 2 more clusters operational. Next slide, please. So here we go. I think this is a really important one for a rural area, and that's the issue of transport. We're going to see a sea change, I think, in relation to the way in which we connect places through transport and mobility over the course of the next 12 to 13 years. We know that there's going to be increasing amounts of renewable energy supply. So, for instance, next door to where I work, Stanley Oil Refinery, it has the largest biodiesel plants in the UK located there, and it will have the largest bioenergy aviation facility refinery in the UK, potentially in the world, operational by 2025. I could go on about different forms of transport there, but there's the dates on the left-hand side. But it's the bioenergy aviation fuel and the renewable fuel that I will come back to when I argue about the interconnectivity between the rural and the urban or the industrial. Next slide, please. Waste is a key one, I think, and here again we've got some very ambitious targets that the government is setting. And I think, again, the issue of waste here may well provide us with an area of focus for rural areas. Where is the waste going to? The extent to which much of that waste could be turned into biogases or could be turned into energy, which would otherwise maybe just emit carbon into the atmosphere. Now, at the moment, if it goes to an incinerator, of course, that carbon still goes into the atmosphere. But can we bolt on carbon capture plants onto the back of those facilities? And therefore, it becomes a carbon negative, a net negative opportunity rather than just emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So I think there are significant opportunities about waste products on the rural journey to net negative. Next slide, please. And finally, the whole issue of energy. We know that we've got coal that will no longer be used. It was being used this morning, by the way. I think 2.5% of grid electricity was produced by coal this morning when I looked at about 7:20. Offshore wind, massive trajectory increase, going from 10 gig today up to 40 gig by the end of this particular decade. We know that small modular reactors are coming on, and we know that the government's trying to push for heat networks. I'm not so sure how much heat networks will come on stream between now and then. I've got a Geordie Morrill that's come on my screen and I can't see very much. So Geordie, if you could turn your camera off, please. Named and shamed, thank you very much. And we know that by 2035, there'll be no more power from hydrocarbons. An interesting date for us, and it's not that far away, 16 years away, is the end of renewable energy certificates. And so some lobbying might need to go on in the not too distant future, certainly for a place like Shropshire, framing their policies to be thinking about what's coming down the line. Next slide, please. What I really want to argue today in terms of the energy transition and the net negative opportunities for Shropshire is the whole biomass agenda. I'm sure many colleagues on the call have probably seen the different announcements that have been coming out over the last 2 to 3 weeks around biomass innovation and policy. And if you haven't, I would argue with you that it is something that perhaps Shropshire might like to consider. A couple of weeks ago, Bayes launched a biomass innovation programme, and I think it's something that Shropshire should be looking at. Biomass, rural areas, generating crops for bioenergy and for bio-use. Secondly, they've recently published, I think it was just a couple of days ago actually, the role of biomass in achieving net zero. It's only a policy area at the moment. There's no white paper there yet. It's just a thought piece. And again, just before COP, they released their biomass policy statement. It's not a white paper. It's not going to become law yet. But I suspect you want to watch this space because I do think we're going in one direction in relation to biomass. Next slide, please. So here's the different sort of policies that are really driving at what I think is the biomass and the bioenergy transition in the UK. You've got the whole sustainability agenda where we are looking for increasing green initiatives. The air quality agenda, I was anticipating government would make some air quality announcements before COP. They haven't, but they have promised that in the new year, something will be coming out around that. Net zero, that's what we're talking about today. The circular economy, that's another area that we're talking about today. I won't go into too much detail about these particular issues. Have a look at this slide, which I've taken from Bayes, published a couple of weeks ago. Next slide, please. So my argument, biomass is a significant opportunity on the net negative journey for rural areas. Grow the crops, use them for energy and for power through gasification, pyrolysis, combustion, anaerobic digestion. You're using them already in Shropshire. And so in essence, they're fairly close to net negative as it is, but some emissions associated with it, especially when you burn them, you've got quite a lot of carbon emissions. What we need to do is to make sure that we're putting carbon capture facilities onto the back of this, capturing that carbon so that we're removing the carbon from the pyrolysis process and the gasification process driving those turbines. Already relatively net zero because it's biomass. You're harvesting the crops, using them to generate energy, then you're growing more crops. So it's already relatively net zero because the crops are taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. Carbon capture bolted onto the back of the energy process, it suddenly becomes net negative. And then on the right hand side here, I think there's a whole series of different vectors, different areas that this can be used for. I've already talked about biodiesel and I've talked about aviation, but there's a whole series of other sectors there. If you have this CC, carbon capture and storage, carbon capture of utilization capability in place, that's in place, suddenly rural areas, the future of rural areas looks quite rosy because it's not net zero, it's net negative. And I think that's the trajectory of travel for areas like Shropshire, really important in terms of a biomass for the future of the economy. Next slide, please. So where does the carbon, once you've caught it, where does it come to? Well, I think it will come to this sort of area and it will be put into pipelines and shipped out to the East Irish Sea to be stored. But also, where will that biomass come to? Well, again, it could well come to these particular areas. On the left-hand side here, I've talked about the opportunities of different areas and different fields that they could tap into. But we do have the issue of air quality that we might want to consider, and I think there are opportunities to do research in the area of air quality in this space. But the feedstock from rural areas and the future of biomass use is going to be key. Next slide. Why is it going to be key? That's because of this. If one looks at the Committee on Climate Change recommendations around biomass, you can see from this slide that they see it as being the best way to achieve carbon reductions and the best alternative in terms of of the approach of the UK economy right now. I'm a great fan of Lord Deben and Chris Stark. I think they've got the messages absolutely right to date in terms of the various carbon budgets they've produced on the trajectory to net zero by 2050. But I do think that through the carbon capture, through the Committee of Climate Change methodology report, they are putting out some significant challenges around here for biomass, for jet zero, for biodiesel, lots of opportunities here that we need to tap into and look at. And I do think the rural, interconnected with the industrial, is going to be will play a significant role. That connecting of those different places will play a significant role in realising this opportunity. Next slide, please. The evolving regulatory landscape, well, it was very favourable a few years ago. Now it's looking a bit, well, which way will it go? But I think it will go towards biomass. But more importantly, I think it will go towards penalising emissions. And we will see a sea change in terms of support, levies, incentives, going away from traditional energy flows to carbon flows and carbon emissions. And I think we're on that trajectory of travel now, given the different consultations that are emerging from government. And so I think in the future, there'll be much more of a focus on carbon pricing rather than energy pricing, particularly around taxes and penalties. So again, I think the regulatory framework will continue to be relatively supportive around biomass, where there is carbon capture and utilisation, carbon capture and storage associated with its use. Next slide, please. I've already said much of this, and that's the Committee on Climate Change, but I just again wanted to focus on the top there. The best use of biomass is at the moment through wood construction, but in due course there are significant opportunities for other forms of biomass as well. Industry, power, hydrogen remains the best use, third bullet point down, figure 6.6 in their report. Please have a look at that in Shropshire if you are considering the bioeconomy as being a future, maybe anchor to the whole energy transition and the net zero, net negative transition. Next slide, please. We'll go through past this slide. I've already covered some of this. Next slide, please. Now, what are we doing at the University of Chester around this? Well, there's a whole series of projects that Juliana kindly alluded to in terms of the introduction. There's the HyNet project, and I do think the connectivity between Shropshire, just to the south of Cheshire, and the HyNet project is a real potential. Not now, because we've got to build the infrastructure for what's going to be operational by 2025. But I do think, colleagues, there will be significant opportunities for 2030, and we might want to start thinking about that. Mission innovation, colleagues, the University of Chester hosted the last face-to-face meeting of the hydrogen mission innovation, the Hydrogen Challenge, back in December 2019. And colleagues, you may well be aware of the breakthrough themes delivered at last week's COP up in Glasgow. And one of the key ones was hydrogen. And the UK will be one of 3 governments in the world leading a global assembly under mission innovation around hydrogen. So biogas potentially from using biomass to biogas, hydrogen, carbon capture, net negative. I can see that being significantly funded with revenues associated with that. IDRIC, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, we're leading, we're a co-investigator on that project. We're leading on the skills theme for the UK around net zero skills. We're heavily involved in a project looking at a net zero master plan for the northwest of England, bottom left-hand side here, with the academic leads on that. I've mentioned our role in the hydrogen strategy. Do look at chapter 3 in there. We're very much involved in the proposals from National Grid for something called Project Union, which will be a hydrogen-ready network in place by 2030. And then finally, we chair something called the Northwest Hydrogen Alliance with about 30 different companies involved. Next slide, please. And hopefully this is the final slide. I've tried to argue with you today about the role of biomass as being an opportunity for rural areas to not just achieve net zero, but to achieve net negative. I've argued that about the interconnectivity of places, trying to build upon Richard's presentation earlier and some of the key activities of the Connected Places Catapult, and connecting the rural with the urban and industrial area, with the industrial and urban area to realise net zero and net negative. My screen's going bonkers with questions, but never mind. This is the HyNet proposition. You'll see lots of different things that we're doing in the HyNet proposition, but the one I would want to link you to, or two I'd want you to consider, is the issue of bioenergy, the refinery, the bioenergy, electric power plants that are being built at the moment in this particular area, the biodiesel plants. Where is the bio going to come from? Could it come from Shropshire? But also the carbon capture and utilisation and storage facilities that are being built here in the East Irish Sea. Could we capture the carbon, for instance, in the Shropshire area on the back of biomass plants and potentially store it in the East Irish Sea, or even utilise it in various areas of Cheshire? Already in Cheshire, we have the country's largest carbon capture and utilisation facility at Northwich, at Tata Chemicals, where they're capturing their carbon, mixing it with the salts that they're extracting and making biocarbonate for people who have got dodgy hearts of a man of my age after doing too many presentations like this. I'm going to finish on that point before I need to go and take a fix of sodium bicarbonate. Thank you very much, Juliana.
Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. Net negative, decarbonisation, industry. I shall take that away as well today. Really interesting that you talked about the polluter pays principle. It was formally articulated in the year of my birth, so you can work out exactly how old I am from that by the OECD, and we are still talking about it, you know, many years later. And I like the way that you brought, you know, the polluter pays into how we can connect the geographical communities to pay going forward. So thank you ever so much for that, Joe. I know you can't stay for the panel session. Would you happily take a couple of questions, or do you need to dash?
No, I'm happy to take questions. Goodness knows what's going to be thrown at me. I could see questions pinging in on my screen. Whether or not I'll be able to answer them robustly, I don't know, but I'll try.
Okay, Kat, would you be able to read a couple of questions out for Joe, please?
Yep, I can. Hopefully people can see me. So I'm looking at the questions, that's why I'm not looking at the screen. Yeah, so Joe, you've got a few questions. This one from Anne, who'd been speaking to people since COP26, and many want to take action, but cost is an issue. And we can argue that the more who buy, then the price will reduce, but this is slowing the speed of change. How can individuals be supported, and are there any opportunities to join with others who are interested?
Yeah, I think one of the key issues here for us to consider, colleagues, going forward, and one of the key challenges I think that I want to throw at government during the course of the next few years, is the amount of carbon that we're actually consuming in the goods that we actually use and wear and eat. I'm very conscious that the UK has exported a lot of its industries over the course of the last 10 years, 15 years. And I am concerned that one of the things that we're doing, we're on this energy transition, and we're actually hitting our carbon targets. But in so doing, what we're doing is losing a lot of our industries. We're exporting them, but then we're buying the products back. So at the moment, we've seen something like a 60% reduction in the amount of carbon that we emit, 50% reduction in the amount of carbon we emit from the UK, but the amount of carbon that we're actually consuming in our products has only gone down by 4%. What does this mean for a place like a rural area like Shropshire? My fear is that we may well see the export of the agricultural sector because of the emissions associated with agriculture. But they will happily do trade deals with New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and then import the goods back. Yeah, we'll reduce the emissions from the UK, but we're actually end up consuming more emissions because of the food because of the food that we eat. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I'm just ranting, but I enjoy doing things like this, Juliana and Kat, as you know.
Thank you very much. And that possibly kind of answers this next one, which is from Ben, which again is talking about growing crops. And just as with regards to growing crops for energy, there's a massive equation regarding land being taken out of production for food. And have you got a view on this? And I guess that kind of links to what you just said about that previous question.
Yeah, there is a significant challenge there. The question for us is potentially what is the best utilisation of land in terms of hitting the net negative ambitions that I have. We are in this climate and ecological emergency, colleagues. And last week's COP didn't deliver what I wanted it to deliver, much to my annoyance and frustration. We are in this climate and ecological emergency. So as a country, we've got to ask some critically constructed questions about how we can transition away from net zero, where we will stay in this climate and ecological emergency, to a net negative future. And so for crops, we may well want to ask some questions about the extent to which we can feed ourselves utilising current crop manufacturing processes, or would it be better to grow crops for biomass with a view that then we can actually capture the carbon from that? I do think there's a balance there to be made. I've made one argument today around biomass opportunities, but it's a balance that I would invite people in Shropshire and other rural areas to consider.
Thank you. I'll just squeeze one more quick one in from Sam, which again links on, but do you think is the technology financially feasible to roll out the very expensive 85 to 90% efficient technologies throughout rural environments specifically?
No, not yet. That's why the government at the moment, colleagues, I've been consulting until a couple of weeks ago around carbon capture, carbon pricing, carbon utilisation, hydrogen business models. At the moment, they can subsidise certain sectors in relation to methane and hydrocarbons through revenues, incentives and taxes. What I'd like to do is to get, well, what government are doing right now are looking at where those revenues, incentives, taxes can be better deployed in terms of realising that opportunity. So my view is that there should be much greater revenues and incentives put over towards biomass, the bioeconomy, to support this energy transition, particularly if carbon capture is associated with that and carbon utilisation is associated with that. Colleagues, COVID has cost us an arm and a leg. You think that's cost us a lot, and it's been good money spent because we've actually reduced, it's been a really challenging time, but it's cost us an arm and a leg. Global environmental change will cost us a lot more to address. So again, we need to throw that into the mix, and I would ask the environmental economists on the call to be doing some work on that. I'm being kicked off because Big Town Plan is coming in, I'm afraid to say. Would love to come back, Juliana Katz, and do more at some point.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm conscious there are a few more questions, but I'm conscious that it's 10:40, so we need to get on to the next people. So thank you, Joe.